before we started, I was in the US around 2 weeks ago, and I got on a plane during a pandemic, partly because I needed to keep my green card. So, it's not necessarily considered as mitigating circumstances, a pandemic. So I was forced into a decision I'm not necessarily happy about or happy with. But to really answer your question, it depends on the context. If anyone's looking at me and going, "You are an immigrant," and have thrown that at me as an insult, bring it. Yes, I am. I come from people on the move. I'm not ashamed of it. And there was a reason why they left their home countries. Usually it was on behalf of family or the children, few for the sake of adventure. There's nothing wrong with that. And I embrace that. That's what I am. The issue I have with the moniker is related to the writer part, where individuals may feel as though immigrant writers can only write about the immigrant experience. And I'm curious about what that is necessarily. Because, some of the writers I genuinely admire, I can think of one right now, Vandana Singh, who writes science fiction. She's glorious as well at what she does. And even to pick apart what Grace does and what Mona does, or even what you do, and go, well, that's clearly an immigrant story. And I'm going to steal Mona's line here. But what isn't? Are you really trying to tell me that, there are stories out there that isn't necessarily about people who don't think about movement? We all think about movement. I think the shock for some of us, at least here in Abu Dhabi, when I speak to my students, is it was quite the reality check. And this is going off on what Grace and Mona was saying. Students who bought into the idea that they could really move and go anywhere they wanted because they were interested in knowledge had to settle with a compromise, quite a brutal one, in fact, that you can't go anywhere you want right now, because technically it's not just the age of sickness, it's also the age of separation. I was struck by one example over the summer, and I think a German newspaper broke the story, talking about how France and I think Germany were accusing the US of steering ships away from destination countries, and because they were carrying medical supplies that were in demand, and they paid cash. And I thought that interesting, because right now it's almost, it's really about who is in charge and who has the power to do what they want. That's sobering. But to, again, really answer what you're asking me, am I an immigrant writer? Yeah, sure I am. Do I only write about immigrant things? But it's not an aisle at the supermarket. Show me the immigrant section. Even if you look at the Restless catalog, people do all sorts of things. That's what I think is important to sort of flag. That you can't compartmentalize all of us. You shouldn't. And that's why context is important. So if anyone throws the word immigrant, which I don't know how it became an insult, I sort of do, and says immigrant, I'm like, yeah, happy to say so. That's what I am.
Mona, 10 years without seeing your family. You went very quickly through that sentence. I got stuck in that sentence. I can't imagine getting stuck too long in that sentence. It pains me to hear it. There was one invitation in the invitations that I sent out when putting together the anthology. Mona, I wrote to a writer that, like the three of you, I admire profusely. She is in her maybe 85, I was going to say late 80s, but 85. And she wrote back something like this: Ilan, my best friend the body of my best friend just left to the morgue. My daughter is in the hospital. I have nothing else to say. I wonder, Mona, how you connect with this idea of immigrant that I was asking both Grace and Deepak, and also with the idea that you convey so beautifully in your piece and that you were talking about of silence. Because there's something that has happened to many of us now, and that is that silence has arrived in a different way than in normal life. We are isolated and we hear we hear more the cracking of a door, maybe because we have more time to hear the cracking of a door, and we hear less voices. You say that your sign makes you want to feed from the energy of others. So I'd love to hear also your relationship with silence.
Yeah. I would say, I would say that we are definitely becoming more sensitive toward each other. I feel like we do feel frustrated at failing to express that. I can feel it even in the way we speak to each other, exchange messages or emails. We just so concerned for each other, and I do appreciate this shift. I feel like we do realize that we've taken each other for granted, even the closest people to us geographically, we are realizing this. And because you shared the story of your friend, I want to tell you also a similar story. I studied in upstate with this Argentinian philosopher, Professor Maria Lugones, and she died a couple of months ago. And it really broke my heart that she had to die alone, because of COVID restrictions and everything. And it just happened so because she is an immigrant who's lived here for like, I don't know, 5 decades. And she was someone who devoted her life to this idea of alternative community, right? How do we make alternative communities, especially because she's thinking as like an indigenous and queer woman, so she devoted her life to do that, and there was no one to be there for her at that moment, and it just like, it broke me, it made me furious, it made like so much, it just like, and it's so hard to fight that despair, right? That despair, which sometimes like really overcomes mourning even, or grief. Yeah, so I don't know. I want to say also about, just, I guess, like being an immigrant, I feel like we have been forced to be to be ready for this moment somehow, and not to say that we are like invincible or something, I've seen that some people, like when the crisis started, when the pandemic started, one person I was working with was like, oh, all of you are Arabs, you're gonna be fine, you've seen worse. And I was just like, wow, how awful to say this, how like, yeah. So but a lot of this, feels, a lot of this new status quo was just like normal life for us, and I'm trying to just like look at this differently, and take the opportunity to talk to, when I speak to my American friends, I'm like, yeah, like when I guys tell you about my paperwork, this is what my paperwork means. Like, I can't see family, I can't move. It doesn't just mean like I'm waiting for a green card to go on a trip to some exotic island, it's yeah. So mobility has become like such a subject, I think, lately.
I want to, in this anthology, and we came outside and saw the stars again, there are about 60 authors, and there are about 30 of those authors who are translated into English. So there are really 90 contributors. There are the 60 plus the 30 who have done a remarkable job in bringing to the English language the world, the words of those that don't that wrote beautifully in other languages. In many ways, the anthology wants to be about the effort that is so central of translation. And sometimes for some of us, when we see our work in translation, it can feel like, is this me? Is this who I am? And it can also feel like, wow, this is me. This is who I am, with a different mask, maybe. We're talking about masks or covers for our mouths. And in some ways, the translators give us a new facade or a new presentation. I would like you to, there's also the fact that this is being published in the United States and from here in other parts of the world. And at this particular moment, it seems to me that the United States, the crisis of the United States, the recklessness of the United States, the anecdote that you were talking, Deepak, about the United States taking a command of certain routes of boats because it's the United States. The United States is both an incredible platform for immigrant writers, because, you know, being in the publishing industry, I can tell you, if a work is translated into English or is in English, has a much more of a chance to be translated into other languages. Amherst Restless has been functioning as also as an agent for many of our authors, and we get we get foreign rights for Russian and Arabic and Chinese and you name it. So the United States as a platform, the English language as a platform, but English language and also the United States as the sucking of the air. You know, it has to be the United States. It's so I wonder, I don't know exactly what the question is there. It's more of a sharing. Anything you want to do with that comment of mine, Grace, being an American right now, an immigrant in America?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't, I mean, I think only over the past couple of years have I realized this position about English language books in the world. I mean, I should have paid attention more when I was living in the Philippines and asked more critical questions. And only looking back did I realize, like, wait, why was the bookstores mostly filled with, you know, English versions of like Who Ate My Cheese and stuff like that? You know, like popular. It was just like, because I would go to look for books to read, and you know, and those were kind of expensive too, because they were imports and stuff. And so it took me a while to figure out about that kind of like dominance of language, and what that does to even the imagination when there's not many other options of like what is translated in you know, to English in other languages. And then for us, there's such little translated work. Restless does a huge, you know, bulk of that work, and we're lucky for that. But you know, we're missing out on you know, the richness of literature in the world.
Deepak?
Well, this is an interesting question because English isn't the first language I heard, but technically it's the language of commandment, based on my family's history and where they come from, which would be India. I teach an intro to fiction class. This is the first time I'm teaching it, so I'm probably failing. But for their first assignment, you know, I asked my students to produce a work of fiction, and most of my kids are coming from all over, whatever that means. Not one student used a word that wouldn't be considered non-English. And I found that extraordinary because, you know, I teach at an institution where we talk about globalism, we talk about languages, we flag them, we categorize them, we celebrate all that. But the minute they sit down to write, all they can think of is English. And I don't know what to do with that. You know, my family, I speak to them in Malayalam. And now that I think about it, hearing what Mona and Grace had to say, this summer, my father and I had a very strange conversation. My father's in his 70s, and he went to a funeral in India when cases were sort of spiking. And I'm having this back and forth with my dad about why he's an idiot. And then he's trying to convince me that, no, I was 30 feet away, 20 feet away, et cetera, et cetera. I think a month or two after that, I received an email from someone, the husband of a friend of mine, just informing me that she had passed away. And the funeral was quiet because no one could come. So when Mona was saying what she was saying, right, it really hit home. And then I sort of started rethinking what my father did, because language is also about choices. He went to, and this is not someone that he really knew quite well, they were just neighbors. And he wanted to make his presence felt. So he lingered so that they knew that there was a body out there to sort of recognize that someone had left or passed on. My father is still an idiot, but I'm looking at it from the point of view of someone, you know, who's a son. But that's what he did. And when we think about language, you know, it's not just about what you say, it's also about what you do. For the first time in a long time, I had to sort of confront my own vulnerabilities about language. And even this discourse, it's basically a discourse about the hearing, if you think about it. And I have hearing loss in my left ear. And the pandemic sort of forced me to confront it, but put it down on the page and share it with my students. And I felt as though I was sinning when I was doing that, because we are expected as teachers, as people, to feel indestructible or invincible, as Mona was saying. Well, we're not. We're scared. And when I did that, and my first class, my first week this fall, I sort of tapped my ear like this and said, I'm going to be doing this a lot because this is new. I have a hearing aid and I'm going to be adjusting my phone. Not a single student blinked. And so now I can joke about the hearing aid and just make fun of it. And that's language too. So I'll end by saying that language is relevant, irrespective of how you speak it. I don't give a damn if you don't have proper syntax or grammar, as long as you're trying to communicate. And that's why I have a great deal of appreciation for writers who do whatever they want with language, especially poets. And, I used to teach Grace's body papers last semester, and there are moments in there where you go, this is not English. And that is so bloody wonderful. Because the world isn't just about the English language. Even the English language is a bloody buffet. And I'm tired of trying to explain that to people, where, you can say things in different ways. And we're writers, Your anthology, what Restless has put out, is something I need to return to because it helps me remember. That's what language is. Language is memory, irrespective of what you do. So, I'm not necessarily answering your question. I'm just glad you asked it. And that's why these conversations are important, because we don't know what the other is thinking. And when you have an opportunity to engage, you do that because you feel it's important.
Mona, language as memory, said Deepak, and also as a bloody buffet. I love that one. Your take on the English language as a straitjacket and also as a platform?
Yeah, so the thing is, one time me and Deepak talked about this question of English, because in my case, in his case, that wasn't his native language. And in my case, I am actually a published Arabic poet. And then in the United States, I started writing in English, and I really tried my best to resist it. But I think that the big reason that really pushed me toward that is the fact that this is such a monolingual country, despite the reality that this is such a diverse place. We speaking our languages never leaves home, right? Like never leaves, I don't know, like the community restaurant or something. It's such a monolingual language, and this monolingualism is so gated and protected, by the publishing industry, by whatever, even the imaginary, and of course, there have been attempts to challenge this, especially I would of course credit Chicano writers, Latin American writers. I've learned from them. I felt like I got some of the courage reading these people who are unapologetically are writing and saying, well, maybe some of my writing is not going to be accessible, so what, but I want to tell you, also just in connection of the language question and the immigrant category, I feel like when I was still living in the Middle East and writing in Arabic, I never questioned these universal notions of writing as in the sense you're gonna be universal. You can't be too specific. You can't be inaccessible, as if that's something against you or something, And slowly, I think the greatness of writing in English is that you realize it's we make this literary domain, we the strangers, we the bilinguals, multilinguals, and so on, and we keep it relevant, we keep it always reviving, always challenging itself, bringing new things, so I learned to embrace both together. I learned to not feel guilty anymore about writing in English. I still write in Arabic, not feeling guilty about being called immigrant, refugee, whatever all these categories are, because yeah, so what? This is my world. This is my life, and if you are devaluing the category of the choices, that maybe says something about you and how you, devalue people, right? Not necessarily just, people say, oh, it's maybe ghettoizing. No, I don't think so. I think our experiences and the aesthetic we create, and all these choices that we make, we do extend the borders of whatever hegemonic narratives you've offered. We make all of this more accessible, more not accessible, let's say more without borders, let's say.
I mean, to use the word extraordinary is really not to reach where I would like to go. I think that the comments, the reflections that the three of you have offered have been priceless. I'd like to bring Brad back, because I see that there have been some questions, and it's important to bring in the other.
Absolutely. So I wanted to first start with one that was not asked in the Q&A box, but the asker is not able to stay with us for the rest of the evening, but is going to watch the recording of this later, and they had a really phenomenal question. Let me see if I can locate it here. Okay, I'm just going to read the entire comment, which I think gives some important context to the question as well. And this is from apologies on pronunciation, Chandrayi Lahiri. As an immigrant aspiring writer, Deepak's point resonates with me too. For me, an immigrant story is just a story because every perspective I have is necessarily informed by my immigrant status, even when I think it is not. So how do you stay true to your voice and not feel like you are pandering to meet quote unquote immigrant themes as others see it?
Beautiful. Anybody? Deepak, you want to take it? I don't want to take it, and I'll tell you why not. Every year we have the Immigrant Writing Prize, and we have 300 manuscripts, and many of them do exactly what this wonderful question. Go ahead.
I'll try. What I can say is, and this is not necessarily me blowing smoke up Ilan's, you know what. When I was working on my manuscript, it took a long time to finish it. And I was submitting it to publishers, and we'd get responses, my agent and I, and they would tell me, if you could make it a little bit more understandable, or if you write the novel that makes sense, then you can experiment later, because then you have the platform to do that. And that sat quite, I suppose I can say that didn't sit very well with me, because I didn't know how to write any other way. Because at the end of the day, what I was doing was I was dipping into my experiences and trying to put that on the page. I use writing to negotiate or navigate the world. And so I put the book I knew how to write out there. And then when Restless picked it up and sent me that email saying you won, I didn't know what to do, if I'm being completely honest. Because yes, there are tropes, but occasionally when you write, what you want to do is you want to push back against the tropes. I grew up in Abu Dhabi, the son of transients. There were very few books out there in English that spoke to me about my place in society. So I'm not necessarily saying I reinvented the wheel, but I had to try and fail on the page on my terms. And I say that because you never know who you come across at the end of the day. And then when Restless sent me that email, and you sort of realize people do listen. They are willing to take a chance. And when the book came out, right now, as Grace was saying earlier, I'm in a privileged position where I can talk about my work, which is insane. I mean, it really is. There's no other word for it. It's insane simply because I grew up thinking we didn't count. We didn't matter. And then all of a sudden, I have a conversation with Mona later on, years later, about what do we do about our work? So I guess what I'm saying is, you might think you are writing about the tropes that you're expected to write about, but your experiences count. I know this is idealistic. It sounds like a sentence in a Hallmark card, but that's okay. And I say that's okay because the one thing I was when I submitted my manuscript, I think I was honest. And as long as you're honest, Ilan and whoever else is reading it, hopefully they'll see that. If that's any consolation. It's not the best answer, but it's the best I can come up with at 2 a.m.
When I found out that I won the prize, the first thing I did is I went to Porter Square Books and I found your book, Deepak, and I started reading it right there in the store, and I was blown away, and I was like, this is incredible. No one else is doing this. I mean, this is amazing. It gives me like so much confidence and restless for having the vision to publish your book. And it's, I mean, that was probably one of the first things I said to Ilan when we had lunch together was about your book. I mean, it was,
Yeah.
It's so unique. If people haven't read Temporary People yet, I mean, it's just, it's incredible.
I mean, if I may say, not to turn this to a praise party for Deepak, but I do feel less lonely in the world knowing that, Deepak exists, and knowing, like, having read his book, I was so like overwhelmed by, this warm feeling of like, because as he said, you think that you're worthless or you're irrelevant or nobody wants to read your story or your story is so boring or so I don't know, too dark, so like I personally I grew up stateless in Kuwait. I'm stateless now in the US, and that's such a mysterious word. What does stateless mean? And like people ask me like, why stateless? I'm like, how am I supposed to answer why, oppression or why, like the situation? And I gotta tell you, until now, I'm intimidated from writing about these experiences. I try all the time, but I'm intimidated that, I would not do them, like fairness, not like, I don't want to reduce it, but reading the work of Deepak, I want to also mention our friend Andre Nafis Sahli. He is from Abu Dhabi too, but is based in Los Angeles. It just, it feels good to have others and to feel like, even if there's two people who are gonna read it, there's something to that I very much appreciate, and I keep this light inside me, to know that others are there.
Andre also is an extraordinary writer who's also has beautiful poems in the anthology.
Right. Yes.
Back to you.
I think that segues well into a question from SC Hecht. The question is there a time when, as immigrants, we become citizens? It's a big question, I know, but I think it gets at some interesting theme. The interesting things that Mona was talking about statelessness and documentation, and what this idea of citizenship even really means, kind of as a permeable concept in and of itself.
For me, on a most recent level, just the civic action of, going and voting. Like every time I do that, and I didn't get it this year, but like getting the sticker and walking around and other people have their stickers and they're also going to vote. There's something about that, I wasn't allowed to do that for a long time. And sometimes we would even pretend that we were allowed to do that because we wanted to fit in. But once I started really voting and participating, at least for that time period, I feel that how profound that act is, to be able to go do it. It takes 5 minutes in my case, and some people that are waiting for 8 hours. And I bet you're thinking a lot more about what it means to go vote when you're waiting for 8 hours. But it's really profound to be able to do that, especially when I wasn't able to for so long.
It's funny, a couple of years ago, I was asked about citizenship, whether I really wanted it, whether I was in the UAE or even in the US. And I wondered about that because, I was raised by a family who trained me to move all the time. So citizenship was this concept that I couldn't completely embrace because it felt like you can get it. So I guess this is my long-winded and messy way of saying you can claim a place without being a citizen and still count. Because for me and some of my friends, it really is about dignity. And I say that because, now I'm going to sound like I'm on my own soapbox, because I've never voted in any election. I couldn't. In India, you can't vote if you don't live in India. In the UAE, you can't because of how the system is structured. And in the US, I was either a student, I was working, or hunting for paperwork, and I can't vote even now. But when I returned to the US around 2 weeks ago, and I was in New York City where I used to live and work, it broke my heart because it's a city I care about, and I didn't want to. And sometimes you just don't know that you've fallen in love with the place because it mattered to you at some point in your life. So for me, it really is about claiming spaces and places because, we grew up with the idea that you may never get the documentation. Even now, I say I have a green card. The assumption is the passport will follow. But I say the assumption, and I always hyphenate that because that's the hope. But if you don't have that, what remains? So for me, the question is not necessarily about being an immigrant and being a citizen. It really is about being in a place where someone tells you that you matter. And they don't necessarily have to shake your hand and say, thank you for being here. You've been tremendous. Not at all. You just want to walk down the street and be okay with what you look like, your skin tone, how you talk, irrespective of how you talk, you just feel okay. And I don't think that's a lot to ask. So that would be my way of looking at that question.
If I answer this, citizenship is a lifelong question for me, and it was always a source of anxiety. Technically, it still is, right? But I guess it's no longer something I seek, in the urgent way. I just feel like I feel like it's like a myth that has been debunked for me somehow. And it maybe on the other side, it just allowed me, to see how it's like a tool of exclusion and everything, and it's a way to manage things. And I feel like, coming to the United States, I thought like, well, this nightmare will end, but it turns out it just like takes a different color, and I want to say, like, when Trump got elected, and even, with this new election, there was this conversation of like, do we leave the country, right? Like, and that was like awful to me, because I'm like, oh my God, like I went through this experience. I don't want to live this again, like, and even if I go to somewhere else, is this going to be any better, So, and this is when I stopped and thought like, oh, I guess that's what it means to be a citizen, like when you are stuck and you can't like change places. And I don't know, I guess the last thing I would say is that, we are seeing how all these constructions of citizenship, nation states are really falling apart for everyone. And, we are having to contend with like new keywords, new, thinking of new things and new ways of like belonging, at least.
Brad, you want to do one more question and then we wrap it up?
Perfect. Yeah, so we only have one more question, so that works out very well. This one comes from Carol Davis, and this is shifting our focus, I guess, a little bit back more towards COVID and talking about the current situation that we're in. It's from Carol Davis. How is the writing/reaction to COVID different based on the author's age?
Anybody who would like to respond?
Ilan, I think you should answer this too.
Because I'm the oldest, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I really don't know how to answer that question, Deepak and Brad and everybody. I can tell you that receiving the items, the various pieces for the anthology was incredibly revitalizing. There are people there that are in their 30s, and there are people there that are in their 80s. And if I could dare to think of an arc that brings them all together, is the sense of strangeness that all of them have in approaching this moment. No matter how seasoned you might be, or how matured, or how wise, or how aged, the fact is that this is absolutely dislocating and nerve-wracking. Maybe I could answer by saying that as a teacher, I feel my heart goes for my students. My heart goes for the young people who have organized their dreams in particular ways. And all of us have this series of dreams that go from our forehead forward. And life is a way to handle those dreams, that sequence. And many of my students, many of the young people that I interact with have had to postpone or to cancel or to rethink, which is a perfectly human and invaluable experience. Of course, one always thinks, well, if life was normal, then you would simply be able to embrace this one and embrace the other one. I think of when the election took place on Saturday, when it was decided that Biden had won, it felt to me like V-Day, the experience that there was such a burden in everybody's back, and certainly in my back. And I had read time and again novels and saw plays and movies about V-Day, but I just felt that it must have been this way, that there was a sense of relief, that something was ending, that the heaviness of history was coming to a stop. And I loved being in New York City just by coincidence that day. And all the young people were dancing on the street and throwing champagne and using pots and pans and making all sorts of noises. It was beautiful. I don't know if there's an answer to that question. I like the way Deepak always says, I don't know if I'm answering the question. I don't know if I'm answering the question. I don't have really a word of advice. I do have one that is not directly connected with it, but I think I gather like a sponge from everything everybody has said. Being an immigrant or being a citizen, or not being an immigrant or not being a citizen, the only thing that matters to me as a reader is the humility and authenticity that can come across in the page, no matter how complex those words are going to be, no matter how you have dismantled language for the rest of us to enjoy. If you have dismantled it with care and conviction in an authentic and humble voice, then that message is going to come across, and we're going to be shaped by it. It is so important not to think that the shelf is done, that we read the classics because the classics are finished. These guys are the classics. These guys are the ones that are going to be read in the next generation. The shelf is never set. The shelf is always being reconfigured. Books are pushed out and new books are brought in. And I just love the fact that writers take that leap of faith and say, I don't know if anybody's going to read me anywhere, but I'm going to write it anyhow. And let's see where it falls. And these three writers are incredibly courageous for that. The work has fallen on some of our ears, and we are the better as a result.
Thank you, Ilan.
Yeah, thank you. What an ending!
Yeah.
Would any of you like to respond to the question, or do you want to leave it at Ilan's beautiful response?
I like how Ilan's sidestepped, danced his way around it, and then also said what he wanted to say. No, I think that's a wonderful way to end. I will say, though, is the realization I have had, and my hope, because we've talked about hope quite a bit, is I hope we pay more attention to those who are aging. Because if there's anything that I'm struck by during the time of COVID, or the age of sickness, or the age of separation, is how I'm reading narrative treating the elderly as dispensable. And I find that just ridiculous. And also to be a little bit more kinder towards the living and not necessarily humankind, everything else too. Because I think that's important. And I'm not saying that because I'm ancient. I'm just saying that because, like Ilan was saying, I think we can do better. I think joy is possible for those tuning in, especially if you want to write. These are hard times, but we try. My students, because Ilan mentioned the students, and I'll end with my students as well, I feel for them. I really, really do. But the only useful thing I've done all semester is when I ask them whether they want to make a playlist, which I'll play from my office at high volume at some point next week. And they're like, that makes sense to us. And that's good enough. That's good enough for me. So again, even I'm not answering the question, but I also wanted to thank Brookline for this moment, and to thank Grace and Ilan and Mona as well, and you too, Brad, because this has been cool as early as it is in the morning, and I'm grateful. Yeah, I'm just grateful. So thanks.
Grateful to each of y'all too, and I think that is a really beautiful place to end it. I like that the conversation has sort of mirrored the descent into the inferno, and now we have come outside and saw the stars again, if you will. Thank you everyone who has joined us today. This has been a really, really wonderful conversation with really, really wonderful people, and I'm grateful to them for being here. Once again, I already said thank you, so I guess that's everything. The ending of events is always so fun. Just appreciate all of you being here. Once again, Brookline Booksmith, you can get your holiday shopping done early if that's something you need to do. Thank you all for being here. And I guess that's all we have. Have a good rest of your days. Take good care.
Good to see you guys. Take care of yourselves.
Good to see you.
Bye-bye. Be well. Keep sane.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.